The TC39 group has actually been very generous with regards to the array API. So there's been a lot of new methods added in ES6, and we're going to take a look at all of those methods in this video. So first of all, just to have a sort of like an initial setup, let's say we have a list of users here, and it's basically just going to be an array that contains a bunch of objects. So let's say the first one is going to have a username. It's going to be Alex. Okay, he's going to have an email of alex@gmail.com, not a valid email, of course. But let's say we also have two other objects. We have Joe, okay, joe@gmail.com. We're also going to have Mark, and I'm also going to have a unique email. Next, let's say we also have a user input of an email here. So imagine your user types in the email address to the input box. So we might have joe@gmail.com, okay? So let's say you have this email address, but you wanted to find the user inside the users array that has that email address. So there's a special method in ES6 that allows you to do that. And the way you would do that is, well, let's say you want to get the user object, right? So what you might do is you might call the new find method on the users array, right? And once you do that, you need to provide a callback function. So the callback function is going to receive the user object. So we're basically going to loop through every single user inside of the users array. And it sort of resembles the map method that also has a callback passed into it. So the user, like I said, is going to be every single user object once we iterate over the array, okay? And once we get the user object, we can also have a check. Now in this case, we can have the following. So if the user email matches the email address that we have in a constant over here, then we know that the emails match and this is the right user object. And once we do that, we might have a check. So if we do find the user, we want to do console log. Let's use template strings here. We're going to say your username is, and I'm just going to inject user.username, okay? Otherwise, we're going to say console log. Sorry, we could not find a user with that email, okay? Something like that. So as you can see here, we get your username is Joe. And in fact, if we console log the user object, just to see what we get, we essentially get that user object from the array. So once again, what the find method does is it basically returns the value of the first element that satisfies a given test, that satisfies a given callback function. So the callback function essentially returns a condition here. So we're checking if the user email, so essentially the email of this user object, so like I said, this would be one of the objects when we iterate over the users array. If that email matches the email address outside of the callback, so it's just a variable defined outside, then we know that this is the right user and we want to return it. So the find function is going to stop execution and it's going to return that user object, okay? So just keep in mind that this needs to be an expression that evaluates to true or false, okay? And if we're not able to find a user with that email, then in that case, the user object would be undefined. So for example, if I were looking for, let's say, Nina, okay, we are not going to be able to find a user with that email address because we don't have it inside of the users array. And in fact, you could also use the structuring here. So instead of getting the entire user object, we could also get, we're looking for the email property, but we're going to call it user email because we already have an email constant. So I'm going to grab that and I'm going to check the user email against the email. It's sort of optional in this scenario, but I mean, it's up to you. You can keep it if you want. And as you can see here, the user object is actually undefined. Now, the other thing you could also do is you could also get the index of that user object. So instead of getting the user, let's get the index of that user. And the function would need to change to findIndex. And the rest of the function is going to stay the same. In fact, I think I'm going to switch back to user because we already have the email constant. And let's also console log the index. And let's say if we do have the index, then we want to show it. So your index is, and that's going to be the index of the user. Now, of course, we need to adjust that if the index doesn't equal -1, because as you can see here, if we're not able to find a user with that email address, we're going to get -1. So let's switch it back to, let's actually use, let's say, Alex. Okay. As you can see here, we get index 0. If you switch it to, let's say, Joe, that's going to be index 1, of course. And if it's Mark, it's going to be index 2. But if it's somebody who's not a user or not in the list of users, let's say Jordan, we're, of course, going to get -1 for the index, and it's going to go to the second clause. Okay. Now, another method in ES6 would be to get the keys of an array. So let me show you what that means. So let's say we have a console log statement, and we still have the users. So I wanted to call the keys method on the users array. And as you can see here, it's going to give us an iterator. In fact, I'm going to open the DevTools, and let's expand this object. So as you can see here, it's not an array, it's actually an array iterator. And that's a special type of object that the keys method returns. And that object is something that we can actually use inside of a for of loop. So let's do exactly that. So I'm going to say for constant key of users keys. So we're going to get the keys of the users, basically the indices, and we're just going to console log each key. Okay. I'm going to close off the DevTools, and as you can see here, we get everything from 0 to 2, so 0, 1, 2. And of course, the results are completely based on the indices of the array. So if the array changes, the keys that we get are also going to change. Now, getting the indices of an array is not something you would typically do very often, but it's still a possibility. So if you do find a use case that requires that, feel free to use the keys method. And on the same note, notice that we're using a constant here. Now, you might be curious, constants cannot be reassigned values. So for instance, what I'm talking about is, let's say I have a constant here with the name of Alex. So if I were to reassign the name to, let's say, Nina, of course, that's going to fail. Now, the reason that fails, if you open the DevTools, we get a type error, and we talked about that before, and the reason that happens is because you cannot reassign values to constants. So you can change the inner properties of an object. So let's say this was not a string, not a primitive, but let's say an object with the name of Alex. And I try to change the value of that name. Well, let's actually change it to, for instance, first name, just for clarity. And I try to change the first name property on that name object, and I were to console log name. That is still going to work because we're modifying the inner value of the object. But the binding itself cannot be changed. The value can be changed, but the binding to the variable cannot, because we're using a constant. Now you might be asking yourself, if that's the case, then how is the key working inside of the loop? Because we're basically looping through the keys, and then we get the value of the key and we assign it to the key variable inside of that loop. Well, what happens is the constant can actually be used inside of a for of loop. And in fact, if you're really curious about it, you can read it up in the actual spec. But this spec does actually have a definition for a for of loop, in which case you might have a constant variable to which you assign the value of an iterable property that you are iterating over in this case. Now, this is not going to work in a traditional loop. So just to clarify what I'm talking about here is, let's say we have a for loop. So we might have a typical loop. Let's say you want to loop 10 times and we want to increment the value of I. Okay, I'm just going to do console log of I. So this is just a normal for loop. And as you can see here, we get an error that says the assignment to constant variable, and it's basically not allowed. And this is what I'm talking about. So here we're reassigning the value to the constant. But in this case, what we're actually doing is we're recreating the constant variable inside of the loop on every single iteration, and that's why it's able to work. And in the second example with the for loop, we're trying to reassign the value. We still have the I variable. It's the same variable as before, but we're trying to reassign the value to it, and that's why it fails. But with the for of loop, we're actually creating a new variable, and that's why we don't get the error. Anyways, this was sort of like a side note. Just keep it in mind that you are allowed to use constants with the for of loop, and you're not going to get any errors. Now, there also used to be a values method. So in the past, you were able to do something like users dot values, similar to the keys. But if you're going to try that inside of any modern browser, you're going to get an error. And the error is basically telling you that there's no values method on the users array. Now, you could actually verify that. So for example, there is a keys method in the array prototype, as you can see here, right? We get a true. But if you were trying to look for values in the array prototype, you're going to get false. So that's a good indication as to what's going on. There's no values method on the array prototype at the moment, even though the values method is actually defined in the spec. Now, what we do have available in the browsers is another method known as entries. So let's do console log, okay? And we're going to do users entries, right? And as you can see, we get an iterator. It doesn't really tell us much. But let's see what happens if we use that iterator inside of a for loop. So I'm going to use a constant again. Let's have a pair or entry of users.entries, okay? And then we're going to console log that pair, okay? Let's see what we get. We get 3 results. So as you can see here, we get 3 arrays. And the first element in the array would be the index. The second element in the array would be the actual object. And this is actually pretty cool because you could do something like this. So using destructuring, we can actually extract the index as well as the user object from the entry. So the entry is going to give us an array, but we're going to destructure that array in order to get the index and the user. And let's also console log both of those values. I'm just going to clear out the log. Let's console log those values, and as you can see here, we're going to get the index for every single user object, and we also get the user object itself. So this is actually something that might be very useful in certain scenarios. So just be mindful of that method. Let's move on to some of the other methods, and the next one on the list would be the from method. So I'm actually going to open up the HTML tab over here, and I'm going to minimize the console a little bit. So let's say we had a few buttons here. So I have a button. One button is going to say, let's say, checkout, and the other one is going to say cancel. So imagine you have like sort of like an online store, right? And we wanted to bind an event handler to the checkout button. Now I'm going to give it an ID. I'm going to call it checkout. Okay. First of all, let's get the document get element by ID. We're going to get that checkout button. And we're going to add an event listener to it. It's going to fire on click events, and we're also going to get an event object. Okay. So let's just console log clicked for now, just to see that it actually works. So when I click on checkout, we get clicked, right? So let's say once you click on the checkout button, we wanted to disable both the checkout as well as the cancel button. So you could imagine that behind the scenes, you would be making some kind of an API call or doing some kind of other asynchronous processing. But for the time being, you wanted to disable both buttons so that the user will not be able to cancel or click on the checkout again and whatnot. So the one thing we could do is we could get the buttons from the DOM, right? So we could do document get elements by tag name, and we're looking for all the buttons. Now, of course, be careful because that's going to look for all the buttons in the DOM. You might also want to add a class to each button and then target the buttons by the class. But in this simple demo example, I think that's just fine. So once we get the buttons, let's console them log out. Okay, I'm going to open the DevTools. So when you click on checkout, you're actually going to see that we get an HTML collection. Now you might expect that you would get an array, but this object is not an array, it's actually an HTML collection. Now I showed you before that in order to get an array, you might simply just destructure the elements of that collection into an array. So once you do that, when we click on checkout, you're actually going to see that we get an array instead of HTML collection. Now there's a different way to do this as well. There's a new method in ES6 that's known as array from. So when you pass the buttons, in fact, let's call them buttons with an S because we get 2 buttons. So once we do that, let's do console log array from, passing that collection inside. And once you click on checkout, you're going to see that we get an array of buttons once again. Now, of course, like I said, we wanted to disable them. So once we do get them, let's also perhaps, let's do for each. On each button, we want to set the disabled attribute to true. Okay, we want to disable the buttons. So you click on checkout, that disables the buttons. But let's say you also wanted to get the reference to the new buttons. I'm just going to say disabled buttons is going to be equal to a call to array from method. And then we're basically going to do, instead of for each, because for each doesn't actually return anything, we're actually going to call map. So in this case, I'm going to use a bit of a different form. It's going to be an arrow function, but we're going to use a body for that function. We're going to first set the disabled attribute to true, but then we're going to return the button itself. And let's do console log of disabled buttons. Let's click on checkout. That disables the buttons, and then back in the log over here, we get an array of 2 elements. Now, it turns out that if you wanted to map through the elements in this fashion, you don't necessarily have to nest another map call on it. You could actually pass that callback as a second argument to the from method, okay? So if I remove the map function altogether, let's click on checkout again, and we get the exact same array just like before. And now the buttons should be disabled. So if you look for disabled attribute, it's going to be set to true. So this is just one of the ways how you can use the array from method. Now, just so that we're clear with how the method works and operates, there's a bit of a different use case that you might consider. Let's say you wanted to create an array. So I'm going to say numbers, okay? And we wanted to create an array, but we wanted to create an array that contains 5 elements. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The way you would do that is you could also pass an iterable object as the first argument. So it's just going to be an object that has a length property, just a normal object. We're using object literal. And we're also going to pass a second argument, a callback function, that's going to accept the value. So in this case, it's going to be undefined. But of course, you could call it anything. It's just basically, I'm going to use an underscore. Let's say it's going to be an undefined value of undefined. And the second argument would be the actual index. And once you do that, you want to return the index, but you want to increment it by 1. So let's actually see what that's going to give us. So I'm going to console log the numbers. Once you do that, we get 50 elements. Now that's a little bit too much. Let's reduce it to 5. So we get 5 elements, everything from 1 to 5. Now, if you wanted to actually see what's going on behind the scenes, you might console log, let's say the underscore as well as the index. But we also need to return a value. In this case, we're incrementing the index. So we get undefined and 0, meaning that there is a new array in which the first value would be undefined, the value at index 0 undefined. The same for every other value, but then we have 5 of them, right? Index from 0 to 4, 5 values. And then when we map through them, when the second callback is being applied to every single element in the new array, it's going to increment the index by 1, meaning we're starting at 0, we want to increment it by 1, it's going to be 1, and that's going to happen for every single element. That's why we get everything from 1 to 5. Now, of course, be careful here. Let's go back to the previous form where we just had the index. Make sure you use pre-increment syntax, because if you try to use post-increment, what you're going to end up here with is first you return the index and then you increment it, which is pretty much useless because you're incrementing the index, which is a private variable inside of that callback. You want to make sure that you first increment the index and then you return the value from the callback. And as you can see here, we get everything from 1 to 5. So that's just one of the use cases that you might run into. Another array method that's been added in ES6 is array of method. So let's do something like this. We have a console log. We wanted to console log array of, let's say 42. What the of method is going to do, it's basically going to take a value. And in fact, it could be as many values as you wish. So let's say 42 minus 5, 0. No matter how many values you pass, it's going to wrap those values in an array. So it's basically going to give you an array with those values. And like I said, the number of arguments is completely variable. And the arguments don't necessarily have to be numbers. In fact, they could be, objects. You can mix different types. You could even pass the symbol inside. Now, you might be familiar with the array function. So for instance, let's say we have an array function and we wanted to pass 3 to it. Now, what do you think that's going to give us? Well, the array function is actually a little bit ambiguous in the sense that if you have more than one argument, it's going to treat those arguments as array elements. Otherwise, it's going to treat the single argument as the length of the array. So in this case, we're creating an array with 3 empty spots. Now, if you change it to 5, of course, that's going to give you an array with 5 empty spots. But if I pass more than one argument, so let's say I pass 1, 2, whatever, 3, 4, as you can see here, it's going to create an array with those elements. So if I reduce it to 2 elements, it's going to give me that. Now, as you can see, it's a little bit different from array of, because if I just pass 5 to it, that's going to give me an array with the element of 5. So it's just basically going to wrap the 5. But if I use array as a function, that's going to create an array with 5 empty spots. So the difference is pretty subtle. And of course, if you pass, let's say, a string, this string is actually going to be treated as an element. So it's going to be inserted into a new array, and you get a new array that contains that string inside of it. So that's about it for the of method. Now, there's actually a few other ones. So there's a fill method on the array prototype. The fill method basically fills an array with a given value at given indices. That's what it does. And there's also another one that's known as copyWithin. And this guy basically allows you to have a shallow copy of an array based on given indices. Now, these two methods are a little bit cumbersome and a little bit confusing to write. And in most cases, you could simply use the spread operator in order to simplify the operations. So I'll leave it up to you. If you're interested, make sure to check out the MDN docs. But like I said, in most cases, the spread operator is a lot more readable and understandable. So I think we're going to close off at this point. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.